December 6, 1941, near Kalinin, northwest of Moscow. The wind howls across a frozen wasteland where steel and ice have become one. Tanks, once symbols of unstoppable force, now stand silent, stiff as monuments. Frost creeps over their armor plates. Diesel fuel inside the engines has thickened into syrup. Even the mighty T-34 groans in defeat against the Russian winter. Snow drifts around a maintenance yard where exhausted Soviet mechanics huddle beside dead machines. The temperature hovers near -40. Men strike the fuel lines with wrenches, just to crack them open. Every attempt to start an engine ends in a dull whine and a puff of frozen exhaust that dies mid-air. Among them, one mechanic refuses to stop. His face is crusted with frost, hands bleeding through torn gloves. He loops a rope around the flywheel, pulls, stops, thinks, then pulls again, harder this time. The others watch in silence. The engine coughs, sputters, then roars to life. Steam erupts. Diesel burns. For the first time in days, a tank moves. What began as a ridiculous rope trick will soon save dozens of Soviet machines and change the course of a freezing front. By the final months of 1941, the war in the East had become something no army in modern history was prepared for. Operation Barbarossa, launched by Nazi Germany on June 22, 1941, had begun as a lightning assault. More than 3 million German troops and nearly 600,000 vehicles crossed into Soviet territory, confident the campaign would end before the first snow. But the snow came early. The Wehrmacht, built for speed and summer warfare, suddenly found itself bogged down in a sea of mud and ice, engines seized, fuel lines cracked. Men froze beside the same machines that had carried them hundreds of miles eastward only months before. For the Soviet Union, survival meant improvisation. Entire cities had been uprooted and relocated east of the Urals. Factories operated in half-built halls, producing the T-34 and KV-1 tanks in a desperate race to replace what was lost. Yet, these new machines faced the same enemy that the Germans did, the Russian winter itself. Diesel, so dependable in the temperate months, became an enemy at 40 below. Lubricants turned to wax. Steel contracted. Even simple maintenance required. Heating oil with open flames, a dangerous, often fatal procedure. Batteries lost charge within hours. At the front, tank brigades that still possessed working vehicles were forced to keep engines idling day and night, burning precious fuel just to prevent freezing. Others dug pits and lit fires beneath the hulls, blackening the armor and choking the crew with fumes. In the chaos of retreat and reorganization, the Red Army's repair battalions were stretched beyond breaking. They worked in snow trenches with little more than wrenches, crowbars, and torches. Manuals offered no guidance for temperatures like these. Every working tank meant the difference between holding a line and losing a city. The struggle for mobility became a battle of human endurance and mechanical defiance. The Soviet Union's armored advantage, the sloped armor, wide tracks, and powerful diesel engines of the T-34, was meaningless if the engines would not turn. Somewhere amid the desperation, in small repair depots scattered across the front, ordinary mechanics began testing impossible ideas. They learned to drain oil at night and warm it by campfire. They covered air intakes with rags. And one of them, a quiet field mechanic from a forgotten unit near Kalinin, began using ropes, not to tow tanks, but to start them. It was an act born from observation, trial, and cold necessity. And soon it would spread beyond that frozen yard, to entire regiments, a small spark of mechanical genius amid the darkness of winter. By late December 1941, the Red Army stood on the edge of collapse, yet it refused to break. The German spearheads had reached the outskirts of Moscow, their tanks visible from the city's outer defenses. But even as the Wehrmacht pushed forward, their own machines were dying faster than enemy fire could destroy them. The cold did not discriminate. German panzer engines, designed for Western Europe, relied on thin oils that solidified into paste below -20. Their crews resorted to desperate measures, lighting bonfires under engines, draining fuel systems at night, or sleeping atop still warm motors just to keep them alive. Many froze to death before dawn. The Soviets faced the same horror, but unlike their enemy, they were fighting on home ground. Supply lines were shorter. Local villagers understood the winter's cruelty. Mechanics scavenged household items, kettles, stoves, bed linen, to keep steel alive. In this environment, creativity was as vital as courage. The T-34, the workhorse of the Red Army, was both a blessing and a burden. Its diesel engine was more resistant to freezing than German petrol motors, yet still vulnerable at the extremes of the Russian steppe. Frozen coolant could burst a radiator overnight. Frozen oil could shear an engine shaft in seconds. The tank's reliability, one of its proudest features, now depended entirely on the men who maintained it. Maintenance crews, often overlooked in grand histories, became lifelines of the armored corps. They worked by lamplight, buried waist-deep, in snow, surrounded by the stench of fuel and burning wood. Many were former tractor mechanics or factory hands drafted into service. Their ingenuity was unrecorded, their names lost, yet their improvisations often made the difference between victory and immobility. It was in one of these makeshift repair yards near Kalinin, during the Soviet counteroffensive north of Moscow, that a new idea quietly emerged. A mechanic, his name never preserved in the official reports, noticed how the engine's flywheel, when rotated by hand or rope, created friction enough to loosen the frozen oil inside the crankcase. The method was crude but effective. He wrapped a rope around the flywheel hub, braced himself against the snow, and pulled with all his strength. The resistance was immense, but with each heave, the inner components began to move. The compression broke. When fuel was reintroduced, the engine roared, startling his comrades and reviving a machine thought dead. At first, others laughed. It seemed absurd, using rope to awaken steel. But when nothing else worked, they followed his lead. Soon, entire depots adopted the technique. Each rope start saved a tank, and each saved tank could rejoin the fight. The Red Army would later call this kind of improvisation field adaptation. To the men who lived it, it was simply survival. And it was about to change the rhythm of winter warfare. The Soviet mechanic's rope trick was not magic. It was mechanical logic under impossible pressure. At 40 degrees below zero, diesel fuel thickened until it behaved more like glue than liquid. The oil in the crankcase hardened. Pistons froze within their cylinders. Even if a crew managed to turn the ignition, the starter motor lacked the torque to overcome that internal resistance. Batteries themselves, drained by the cold, were often as lifeless as the steel around them. The rope offered something no tool could: direct human force applied with precision. By looping a length of thick cord around the engine's flywheel and pulling sharply, the mechanic bypassed the electric starter entirely. Each pull rotated the crankshaft just enough to break the internal adhesion of oil and metal. After several turns, friction generated slight heat, microscopic but sufficient to thaw the immediate contact surfaces. When fuel was reintroduced, and compression restored, the engine could catch, and the combustion cycle would continue on its own. In technical terms, this was a manual inertia start. Aircraft crews sometimes used similar techniques in emergencies, but never before had it been standardized for heavy armor in subarctic conditions. The T-34's relatively simple diesel design, with its large flywheel and exposed engine compartment, made it possible. A lesser vehicle, with finer tolerances or complex wiring, might not have survived such abuse. This crude but brilliant adaptation turned soldiers into living ignition systems. It was messy, exhausting, and occasionally dangerous. The rope could whip back or snap under tension, yet it worked. And on a battlefield where machinery and men froze side by side, function meant survival. Mechanics' ingenuity did more than restore motion. It restored strategy. Before the rope trick and similar field adaptations, Soviet armored formations were plagued by immobility. Reports from the Western Front Command during the winter of 1941–42 indicated that nearly half of all tank losses were non-combat mechanical failures. Without operational vehicles, counterattacks faltered. Tanks abandoned in the snow became easy targets for German artillery, or worse, markers of retreat. The Red Army's capacity to maneuver, to strike, withdraw, or flank evaporated with every frozen engine. The rope start method changed this calculus. By allowing mechanics to revive tanks even after days of dormancy, it restored an element of unpredictability to Soviet operations. German observers, convinced that frozen armor posed no threat, began to underestimate the Red Army's ability to respond. Soviet armored groups that appeared immobilized at dusk could, by dawn, roar to life and launch sudden assaults. Mobility became a weapon again. Commanders could reposition armor along forest roads or frozen riverbeds without waiting for factory-fresh replacements. Supply convoys, previously stranded, now had armored escorts again. The rope trick was never written into official manuals at the time. It didn't need to be. Word spread from mechanic to mechanic, from unit to unit, as fast as the winter would allow. A single rope, some muscle, and determination transformed the frozen battlefield into one of renewed motion. What began as a field improvisation would soon evolve into a movement of ingenuity that shaped not only mechanical operations, but morale itself. At the heart of every great military innovation lies a simple truth. It begins with a human decision, one act of observation, persistence, or stubborn refusal to give up. The nameless Soviet mechanic, whose rope trick became legend in whispers, embodied that spirit. He was not an engineer from Moscow, nor a designer from Kharkov. He was a field mechanic, a man who had repaired tractors, trucks, and harvesters long before war consumed his homeland. His intuition came not from textbooks, but from the rhythm of moving parts and the pulse of engines under his fingertips. In those frozen days of December 1941, when entire regiments stood paralyzed, this man refused to accept that his machine, his companion in battle, was beyond saving. His hands bled as he worked bare-handed in the snow. Each pull of the rope was a small act of defiance, a statement that ingenuity could outlast despair. To his comrades, the sound of that first engine starting was not just noise, it was life. Steam billowed into the air like breath returning to a dead body. Soon, others mimicked him. In those moments, he became what the Soviet Union desperately needed, a symbol of resourcefulness, proof that the human will could coax fire from frozen metal. At first, the officer corps saw the rope method as crude, even reckless. Regulations forbade non-standard maintenance procedures, and military doctrine was slow to bend to necessity. But doctrine collapses quickly in the cold. Reports from the Kalinin and Tver sectors mention field ignition using manual rotation by late December 1941. By January, entire armored brigades included rope start demonstrations during training sessions. Commanders who once mocked village tricks now demanded them before every engagement. The technique spread horizontally through the army, not by orders, but by survival instinct. Mechanics scribbled crude diagrams in their notebooks. Tank crews shared ropes as standard equipment. The rope became a symbol of adaptation, as essential as fuel or ammunition. In the hierarchy of war, generals plan, strategists predict, but it is often the unseen mechanic who ensures that plans can move forward. Soviet command would later recognize this indirectly through decorations awarded to maintenance units for ensuring combat readiness under extreme conditions. Though the rope trick itself went unmentioned, its influence echoed in every citation that praised initiative and field innovation. On the opposite side of the front, German panzer crews fought their own battle against the cold and lost. The Wehrmacht's engines, finely tuned for precision, proved fragile in the brutal winter. Petrol engines vaporized fuel poorly in sub-zero air, while delicate filters and pumps cracked with each freeze-thaw cycle. German manuals advised heating engines with torches or stoves, but fuel shortages made such methods impractical. Many resorted to draining all fluids each night and refilling them by hand each morning. A slow, miserable process that left them vulnerable. Unlike the Soviets, the Germans lacked the improvisational culture born of necessity. Their maintenance protocols were rigid. Deviation was discouraged. When their tanks froze, they froze as monuments to misplaced confidence. Meanwhile, Soviet tanks, resurrected by ropes and raw muscle, began to move again. To the German observer, it seemed impossible. The same immobilized machines they'd seen at dusk were now rolling toward them at dawn. That sight alone carried a psychological weight greater than steel. Through one mechanic's rope trick, the Red Army gained something no manual could teach: motion in a world frozen still. December 1941. The Moscow counteroffensive. Snow drifts across the battlefield like ash. The temperature plunges below -40. Engines that were coaxed through the night now sit buried under ice. The Red Army's great counterattack, planned by Zhukov himself, teeters on the edge of failure before it even begins. Inside a forest clearing near Kalinin, a battalion of T-34s lies motionless. Crews sit inside their tanks wrapped in rags and greatcoats, breath freezing before their eyes. The order has come. At dawn, they will advance. But dawn is only minutes away, and half the engines refuse to start. The air is thick with panic, not of enemy fire, but of silence. A young lieutenant curses as his tank sputters once, twice, then dies. Another crew lights a bundle of straw beneath their hull, desperate to warm the fuel lines. The smoke thickens, the heat too weak. Then, from the far end of the line, a sound cuts through the cold. A rhythmic grunt, the swish of rope across steel. In the pale light, mechanics gather around a single tank. A thick rope coils around the flywheel. The men brace their boots in the snow and pull. Once, twice. The engine groans, then catches, spitting smoke into the frozen air. A shout erupts. Others grab ropes, imitating the movement. Within minutes, the clearing fills with sound, the mechanical heartbeat of resurrection. Tanks that had stood still for days awaken one by one. The ground trembles beneath them. Diesel, Fumes mix with fog as the battalion roars back to life. Somewhere in the distance, a signal flare bursts red against the gray sky. The attack begins. Those who witnessed it later said that moment felt like defiance made visible. Machines thought dead had risen, not through command orders or supplies from Moscow, but through the will and ingenuity of ordinary men. As the assault moved forward, the difference was immediate. German units, still immobilized by cold defeats, could not redeploy in time. The Soviets, now mobile, executed flanking maneuvers through snow-choked forests. Frozen ground, once their enemy, became an advantage, hard enough to support their advance. Reports from the 1st Guards Tank Brigade that morning note partial restoration of mobility achieved through field start techniques, a sterile phrase that belies the chaos and heroism beneath it. In reality, those field starts were ropes, sweat, and human endurance against the coldest winter in living memory. That dawn near Klin marked more than the start of a counteroffensive. It marked a shift in mentality. From that moment, Soviet mechanics were no longer just repairmen. They were warriors of motion, the keepers of life inside machines of steel. For the men in those tanks, the sound of an engine catching in the cold meant hope. Each ignition was a victory over nature itself. And as they rolled toward the German lines, snow flying from their tracks, they carried with them a lesson. In war, ingenuity could be as decisive as firepower. By nightfall, Soviet forces had regained. Ground thought lost forever. German units, stunned by the sudden mobility of their enemy, withdrew in confusion. Many Wehrmacht commanders would later record disbelief. The tanks they had written off as frozen and harmless had struck back with terrifying speed. The rope trick had transformed from a desperate improvisation into a weapon. Unseen, uncredited, yet devastatingly effective. The winter of 1941-42 became a crucible for both sides. The German High Command, stunned by the Soviet resurgence, issued desperate orders to hold the line. But as their vehicles froze beyond recovery, the Red Army gained something priceless: mobility. In every sector where Soviet armor could move, the front shifted. What began as isolated acts of mechanical improvisation became an unspoken doctrine. Word of the rope start method spread through telegrams, mess dispatches, and even letters home. Tank crews scribbled diagrams on the backs of field ration wrappers, teaching others how to loop, pull, and ignite. By early January 1942, Soviet supply officers began distributing standard ropes to armored units, officially labeled as auxiliary, towing aids, but every mechanic knew their true purpose. Reports from the 33rd Army near Mojaisk record the near-miraculous revival of more than 40 immobilized tanks within 2 days, credited to local methods of pre-start rotation. No central order had mandated it. No engineer had designed it. The rope trick spread like a quiet revolution from the bottom up, a pure expression of adaptation. As the thawing roar of engines rolled across the snowfields, morale rose with it. Tankers who had once cursed the cold now joked that the winter favored those who understood it best. German propaganda referred to the Red Army as the Army of Improvisation. It was meant as an insult. Instead, it became a badge of honor. The mechanical resurrection of tanks changed not only the course of the counteroffensive, but the psychological balance of the war. The Germans, who had once prided themselves on engineering perfection, were trapped by their own precision. Their machines demanded ideal conditions. The Soviets demanded only possibility. A field report from a captured German lieutenant later noted, "Their tanks should have been dead. We saw them frozen for days. And yet, they came alive again, as if the snow itself gave them strength. That strength came not from the snow, but from human ingenuity born of desperation. Each rope-started tank that rejoined the fight multiplied the effectiveness of Soviet armor. It was not a weapon in the traditional sense. It was time, saved, and weaponized. In the frozen forests west of Moscow, the difference was measurable. Soviet forces regained an average of 30% operational readiness across several armored brigades, enough to sustain offensive pressure where collapse had seemed certain. The German advance halted, then recoiled. Historians would later analyze the Moscow counteroffensive in terms of logistics, reinforcements, and weather, yet buried beneath those grand narratives lies this truth. Victory in that winter owed as much to innovation in the snow as to strategy at headquarters. By February 1942, as the front stabilized, Soviet maintenance units were formally ordered to conduct pre-start manual rotations during extreme cold days. The bureaucratic echo of a rope pulled by nameless hands. The anonymous mechanic near Kalinin had set in motion more than just engines. He had proven that survival could be engineered from nothing, that even amid the collapse of systems and structures, human ingenuity could restore movement, warmth, and life. And as the first rays of spring sunlight touched the rusted hulls buried in melting snow, the sound of engines turning over once more carried across the steppe. A reminder that the line between defeat and endurance was often drawn by one man, one rope, and one impossible idea. When the frozen winter finally loosened its grip in March 1942, the Red Army took stock of what it had endured. Entire divisions had been shattered, cities razed, and millions lost. Yet, amid the destruction, a new culture of survival had taken root. One forged not in command offices, but in trenches, repair yards, and snow-covered depots. Reports flowed back from the front lines. Tank readiness had improved drastically despite limited supplies. Mechanical attrition, once catastrophic, was now manageable. Soviet quartermasters noted with astonishment that many T-34s listed as non-operational due to freezing had returned to active duty without formal repair. They called it improvised recovery. Behind those dry reports lay stories of grit and determination. Mechanics who had once been dismissed as laborers were now seen as indispensable craftsmen of war. They worked under canvas sheets at night, their breath freezing as they spun ropes, drained oil, and rewired engines by touch alone. Each tank they revived was not just a weapon, it was a victory over the winter itself. Commanders began formalizing what had once been considered improvisation. Technical manuals distributed later in 1942 included a brief section titled Cold Weather Starting Procedures. Buried within it, almost unnoticed, was a line recommending manual rotation of the crankshaft before ignition to restore lubrication. It was the rope trick, cleaned of its field slang, translated into doctrine. This quiet acknowledgement was significant. For the first time, the Red Army recognized the ingenuity of its lower ranks as part of its official war effort. From that point onward, the Soviets institutionalized adaptation. Factory engineers in Nizhny Tagil redesigned components to improve cold weather resilience, insulated fuel lines, thicker engine oils, and crankshafts with external access ports for manual turning. None of it would have existed without those early field experiments. Without the anonymous mechanic who refused to surrender to the cold. By the time the Soviet summer offensives began in mid-1942, the lessons of that brutal winter had been burned into every unit's procedure. Tank crews carried ropes as standard kit. Maintenance officers lectured recruits about mechanical empathy, the understanding that every machine, like every soldier, needed care to survive. What began as a single act of desperation had become part of the Red Army's identity: adaptability under pressure, victory through endurance. But while Soviet engineers advanced, the echoes of that winter reached far beyond their own lines, reshaping how both sides viewed machinery and men in modern war. The months that followed the Moscow counteroffensive changed the Soviet approach to mechanized warfare forever. The rope trick had proven one truth above all others: that the battlefield rewarded those who could adapt faster than the enemy could plan. In 1942 and 1943, as the Red Army rebuilt its strength, Soviet military schools quietly incorporated field adaptation into their training. Manuals emphasized initiative, urging tank crews to act decisively under mechanical duress. The rigid pre-war doctrines that once stifled improvisation gave way to a new pragmatism. If a soldier could keep a tank running, no one asked how. At Lviv, the Stalingrad front, this philosophy bore fruit. Soviet repair teams, many of whom had survived the 1941 winter, applied those same techniques under siege conditions. Tanks repaired in bombed-out factories and alleyways joined the fight within, hours instead of days. Rope starts, preheating fires, and manual crank rotations became common knowledge, passed from veterans to recruits, from depots to factories. Even Soviet designers began to listen. Engineers at the Uralvagonsavod plant, the largest T-34 producer, studied field reports and simplified engine housings to allow faster access to the flywheel. Later tank models, such as the T-34-85 and KV-85, featured improved cold-weather ignition systems inspired by the very principle the mechanic had discovered: mechanical motion before combustion. The legacy of that idea extended far beyond the Lviv Eastern Front. After the war, Soviet cold-weather vehicle technology became a hallmark of their engineering philosophy. From tanks to trucks to aircraft, designers prioritized function in the harshest conditions. The spirit of adaptation that began in the snow near Kalinin became embedded in Soviet doctrine, and later in their identity as a nation that endured and overcame. In historical terms, the rope trick may seem small, a footnote amid the vast machinery of war. Yet its consequences were tangible. It helped preserve mobility during the critical winter of 1941–42, allowing the Red Army to regain strategic initiative. It empowered the lower ranks to innovate under pressure. And it proved that ingenuity, even born from desperation, could shift the outcome of a campaign. The Germans never developed an equivalent. Their dependence on technical precision, on perfect conditions and rigid procedure, became their weakness. The Soviets' willingness to experiment became their strength. When veterans spoke of that winter decades later, few remembered names, but all remembered the sound, the deep, rumbling breath of a tank coming alive again after days in the cold. That sound was not just machinery. It was endurance made audible. And though the mechanic who first tied that rope vanished into anonymity, his idea endured, a reminder that sometimes the smallest human act can keep the engines of history turning. History often remembers the great battles, the sweeping offensives, the names of generals and their strategies. But beneath those grand narratives lie the small moments, the quiet triumphs of individuals whose ingenuity reshaped the outcome of events they could never control. The mechanic's rope trick was one of those moments. It wasn't written into dispatches or celebrated in parades. It was a fleeting act, performed in the freezing dark by a man who refused to surrender to the cold. Yet in that act lay the essence of the Eastern Front: resilience, adaptation, and the relentless will to survive when logic said survival was impossible. Every war reveals two kinds of strength: the power of machines and the power of the human spirit to master them. The German war machine, precise and engineered to perfection, faltered when perfection met the Russian winter. The Soviet war effort, built on endurance and improvisation, thrived in the very chaos that destroyed others. The rope, a symbol of simplicity, embodied this truth. It connected man to machine, flesh to steel, will to motion. Each pull against the frozen flywheel was a conversation between human persistence and mechanical resistance. It was proof that even in the industrial age, the outcome of battle could still hinge on the strength of a single pair of hands. When we look back at the winter of 1941 to 42, it's easy to see numbers, fronts, and divisions. But behind them were men standing knee-deep in snow, breathing frost into the dark, fighting not only an enemy, but the elements themselves. Their victory was not only over Germany, it was over despair, over nature, over stillness. And so, somewhere in the vast silence of the Eastern Front, amid the rusted remains of tanks and the whispering birch forests, that mechanic's act endures, at invisible but immortal. His rope trick reminds us that in war, as in life, sometimes survival depends not on grand strategy, but on the courage to pull one more time when everything seems frozen solid.